For those of you who perhaps can't see me, I should say I'm another middle-aged white guy sitting in a very blue room. People say I look something between Bill Bailey and Mussolini, depending on whether I'm in a good or bad mood. So very little hair and a bit of a fuzzy chin. I'm wearing a bright blue shirt and a headset and a mic, which I hope is doing the job for you all. I am currently CEO of Wessex Archaeology. I'm also a commissioner at the Royal Commission in Wales, so I have a kind of perspective from both ends of one area of the heritage sector, which is archaeology. But I'm not an archaeologist or indeed a technologist by training. Originally trained as a landscape architect. I think I got a fascination with nature from an early stage and the natural world, and particularly understanding it through systems and cycles, perhaps. So that's why I ended up in earth sciences and practicing as a landscape architect, which I did for 3 or 4 years. So I'm actually fairly comfortable with selling professional services as an entrepreneurial activity. I think early on I was also involved in some micro businesses. I set up a small bike hire company as a teenager, and also sold jewelry on the market to the south of France. So yeah, not afraid of commerciality either. But I've also got a bit of a background in cooperatives in the music theatre sector, and a fair bit of volunteering as well. In fact, that's how I got into archaeology, was through a volunteering route. Personally, I've always found technology kind of satisfying, not least because it filled in some of my shortcomings. You know, not being able to draw particularly well as a landscape architect. I discovered that things like CAD and those sorts of tools assisted me for that. And I had a sort of transformational experience from a CAD teacher who taught me. He was actually a sea captain from Pakistan, and he taught me the few basic DOS commands that were necessary to trawl around networks, and not to do damage, just to go have a look. And in those days, it was possible to wander networks, and I learned an awful lot wandering the corporate networks and government networks that were wide open around the places I lived at the time. But I went working in landscape architecture, I guess, because I was fascinated by the technology. I moved quite quickly into the technical side and became a manager for an architectural practice, and built their networks and transitioned them onto things like CAD and desktop publishing back in the 90s. And through that, I became aware of archaeology and the strong lack of those construction sector technical capabilities that were pretty common in construction. So I moved into archaeology initially, working for the Norwegian Institute of Cultural Heritage Research. I had a couple of excavations in Norway. Supposed to be a couple of weeks. Ended up there 3 years, and from there, having gained a lot of understanding of archaeology, I started at Wessex some 22 years ago. At the time, they would only hire me as a computer coordinator because they were terrified of the term manager. The idea that someone with a computer could also be a manager was a very dangerous idea. I think they've been burned by previous expectations, but so that gives you an understanding of the slope that needed to be climbed, I guess, with trust and acceptance of things digital. For those of you who don't know, Wessex Archaeology is an educational charity. It is now one of the largest in the country, and indeed Europe too. £22 million turnover, 350 people, 5 offices across the country, and trading also in the US and Africa and Australia to a small degree. But it is a charity. It generates cash by providing commercial services to developers, so meeting the requirements of the planning system. But we use all that income and all the information that we found to chase our educational charitable objects, which is the education of the public in the arts, science, heritage, and culture sectors. And our purpose there is to increase people's understanding and appreciation of cultural heritage on the basis that what is understood will be cared for. We serve our clients by solving their problems, and our plan really is to enrich people's lives through a connection with heritage. From a technical point of view, my philosophy has always been that the tech is there to relieve humans from the drudgery so that they can be more creative and spontaneous and have more fun. And that's pretty much how I've always treated the adoption of technology. Big lesson I've had, though, is that one person's drudgery is somebody else's pride and joy. So you do have to be conscious of what the outcomes you're generating when you deploy these technologies. Fairly early on, someone pointed out to me that leadership teams were usually made up of a whole range of different roles. There's a lookout who scans the horizon for new stuff. There's a captain who decides where we're going to go. There's a navigator who decides how we're going to get there, and a chief engineer who keeps everything running. And I think over time I've adopted all, if not, yes, most, if not all of those roles. And it's interesting that in the early stages of digital adoption, the lookout and navigator roles are extremely important. But what I found later on in my career is that actually I don't have the technical information, the technical knowledge anymore to be the chief engineer. So I have to stick to the captain and lookout roles. Taking charge of the digital strategy for an organization like Wessex, I was really expecting, a charity, this is going to be wide open source stuff, not very much money around. But in actual fact, charitable pricing had meant for a long time that commercial tools were actually very affordable. So we ended up with a very traditional, I suppose, corporate almost environment. But what struck me is that the digital adoption has been a process of evolution, not huge waves of revolution. And I think there's a kind of a maturity model behind that. Initially, we tend to go after low-hanging fruit for non-English speakers, things that are easy to achieve, easy wins. And a lot of that is about reliability. So some of the early things I did was to install networks and provide backups, getting the fundamentals right. And then there's a bit about process improvement, and an awful lot of that, from our perspective, was about, frankly, theft, stealing techniques and technologies from other disciplines and applying them in our world. So transfer of technologies into our business, and the entrepreneurial portion of that is that it is about process improvement. It is about broadening the scope of the activities that an organization can take part in. In some cases, insourcing activities, bringing them inside the business so that, or the organization, so that you can generate capture revenue from them. And then I think there's another stage of what I would term integration. So building efficiencies by joining various systems together, whether it's just deep technical level, as we did do. We built dive tracking systems integrating GPS and acoustic positioning and GIS in a database, or process engineering using digital tools to smooth the process of information capture and interpretation and dissemination, which is fundamentally our process. These days, I think it's always been an awful lot to do with process. These days, I think it's moving that we're concentrating an awful lot more on the product. So digital products are pretty much the order of the day. Couple of things that struck me about that. One is that we've been very lucky in having communities around us that have done things like data standards, so the Forum for Information Standards in Heritage and Inscription, and little communities that have grown up around our sector. So things like the Museums Computer Group and Antiquist that we set up back in 2006 and running conferences like the Computer Applications in Archaeology and Digital Pasts. All of those have built these communities in which we've been able to innovate. But where we are now is we're moving into a more transformational, I think was Patrick's word, a transformational mode. So yeah, increasingly the products that we're putting out there are digital, and we like to think of them in two forms. One is that we're creating resources. In the past, we have tended to think of ourselves as information translators. So we'll go and gather information from the environment, we'll interpret it, and then we'll hand it on to someone else who's going to curate it. We're now thinking more of ourselves as curators in our own right. So we're garnering those resources, and I quite like Patrick's model there of sort of industrial progression. I like to think that we're perhaps moving from being a first industrial revolution organization extracting information from the ground into a fourth industrial revolution building organization building its own resource and reworking that resource in a sustainable manner. So the other thing we create is experiences, and that's actually quite important to us, because a lot of the benefits that we see that we can generate for people is the experience of interaction with heritage, and that can be digital, or it can be physical, or it can be a blend of the two. So we're spending a lot of time thinking about and designing those experiences to leverage these resources that we're building. Just as a side note, I noticed today that there was a request in for more resources from our IT team. And they tell me now that the data sets that we're capturing for some of our marine geophysics jobs have moved from the 1 terabyte each to the 20 terabyte each level. And that the digital capture that people are wanting to do on our sites using GoPro, for example, are generating files of 120 gigabytes at a time. So the sheer scale of the digital capture, the digital storage requirements that we have now are 1,000 times greater than they were when I was managing the IT a decade ago. The other big change is risk. The risk around digital for organizations like ours is now enormous. The organization is pretty much dependent on the technology. So my slightly laissez-faire approach to security and compliance back in the 90s really doesn't wash it. So security and resilience and increasingly longevity of the products and the material that we create are now huge considerations. The other change I've noticed is around people. I am self-taught, I guess, largely in my technical areas, and most of the people I've worked with in the early days were self-taught and were generalists. As we moved from adoption to development, we've had more and more people who are specialists, and in fact the specialisms have narrowed and narrowed and narrowed. So you now need 5 or 6 people to build a web stack rather than just one. But interestingly, on the other end of things, generalists have become even more general in the digital skills they're expected to wield. So in a sense, the generalists have become even more generalists. We've now become creators and curators, all of us. So that's very different. Finally, I just wanted to talk very briefly about partners. I've mentioned previously we get a great deal of value out of curatorial organizations who come up with frameworks for data quality and the like, data standards. Increasingly, we're finding that our own clients, people like HS2 and National Highways, have got aligned interests in the education and public engagement areas. So we are finding ourselves working much more closely with those sorts of organizations and providing digital content and digital experience for their purposes. Increasingly, they're asking us to be able to, for example, hold digital content on content management systems for the long term, for 10 years and more. And the other area of partnership is this horizontal one, recognizing that digital removes a lot of the costs from collaboration, and recognizing that there are lots of organizations with aligned interests, the same remit as us. So one thing we've been working on recently is to try and build a shared digital media platform for all of the third sector archaeological organizations in the country. And that's been a really interesting experience. It's still early days. And I guess in shorthand, the lessons we've learned from that is that actually it takes an awful lot of effort to create a collaboration like that. It takes a long time to bring people along to be comfortable with the kinds of purposes that are blended in an idea like that, in that it is both for public benefit and also for profit. It takes a long time to build the trust amongst the individuals who need to be involved. And actually, when organizations are operating in both commercial and public benefit realms, getting access to the leadership, the people who can make those decisions, can be a long and painful process, as indeed can be bringing along the right people with the right skills from within those partner organizations. So I'd be very interested to hear a bit more about the positive experiences that one or two of our other panelists have had. I'd better stop there. I reckon I'll move my 10 minutes by some distance. So